Hey everyone, in this video lecture we are going to be covering the topic about the characteristics of all living things. So the reason we're going to be talking about this is you are taking the course biology, and if we break down the Latin roots of this word, we see that the beginning half, bio, is referring to the word life in Latin, and the ology part stands for the study of. So when you're taking a biology class, you are looking at the study of life. So that brings us to this question of what does it mean to be alive? So there are 8 characteristics that all living things must have in order to be considered a living thing. If even one of these 8 characteristics is missing, that would make this organism or whatever we're looking at not considered a living thing. So we are going to walk through each of the 8. We'll talk about what that characteristic means. The way I like to remember these 8 characteristics of life is to use the acronym CHEDGR. So we're going to go through, we'll start with the C, which stands for cells, and then we'll go through each of these. So just remember that acronym. It will help you remember what these 8 characteristics are. So again, that first letter is the C, which stands for cells. So all living things must be made up of at least one or more cells. There are organisms that are one simple cell, and that is because the cell is truly the basic unit of life. One single cell can be classified as a living thing. But there are organisms that are more complex than that and made up of many more cells, those cells could be plant cells or animal cells. As long as there is at least one cell, that is something that every living thing must have in common. The next letter in our CHEDGR acronym, the H, stands for homeostasis. And what that means is, if we break that word down into its Latin roots, homeo means the same, and stasis means to stay. So we're literally saying in Latin to keep things the same. And what we're referring to is that this organism or thing that we believe to be alive, it needs to keep their internal environment the same. So for example, in humans, we have an internal body temperature around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. If our internal body temperature gets too hot, what will happen is our body will start to sweat, and that liquid water on our skin will evaporate away, pulling away the heat with it. That allows your internal body temperature to cool back down. So this is a way for the human body to maintain that homeostasis. It wants to keep the body temperature the same. If it gets too hot, it will do something, in this case sweat, in order to help cool you down. Similarly, if it gets too cold, your body starts to shiver, and that is to help heat it back up. So it's all about keeping things within that internal environment the same. So if it's a larger complex organism, it's keeping things within that body the same. If we're at the small cellular scale, it'd be keeping things within that cellular environment the same. The next letter in CHEDGR is the E, which stands for energy. And what we mean by this is that all living things need to have some sort of energy source in order to get the energy they need to carry out all the different processes of life. And these processes typically are happening at the cellular level. So for example, in humans, you need to eat food in order to get the energy from the food and convert it into a form of chemical energy that your cells can use to do lots of different processes. And when we look at all organisms across, Earth, there are what we look at food chains, we look at food webs, and this is showing how energy is transferred from one living thing to another. So in this terrestrial food chain where we have a plant at the bottom, the plant gets its energy from the sun and converts it into sugar via the process of photosynthesis, and the energy from that plant is then going to be transferred up to little insects like grasshoppers that consume or eat the plant. And then the energy of the grasshopper will get transferred up to this wasp as the wasp consumes these smaller insects, and so on. The energy will just be continually passed up the food chain. Similarly, in an oceanic food chain, the same thing is occurring. You have little phytoplankton that are photosynthesizing or taking energy from the sun and converting it into sugar. And then small organisms in the ocean will feed off that phytoplankton. So the energy of the phytoplankton passes up to these small little organisms. And then crustaceans, small fish might feed on these small organisms. So their energy is passed up and so on. So no matter what, even if you're a single cell, there needs to be some energy source in order to carry out those cellular processes. The next letter in Chedgar is the D. And D stands for either DNA, well, it stands for DNA, but it's representing having cells with DNA or RNA. So basically, every living thing needs to have some form of genetic material. Some living things have DNA as the genetic material, some might have RNA, and that genetic material will need to be passed on to their offspring. That allows traits to pass on generation to generation. If we continue on in Chedgar, we are at a G, and this G stands for grow. So living organisms should be able to grow from, a simple cell all the way up to a more complex organism, if that is the end living thing that we're looking at. So in this example here, the organism starts out as a simple seed, which then germinates and sprouts into a tiny little plant seedling, and then that plant will continually to grow until it's its full-grown adult. So living things tend to grow from very simple to being more complex. If we continue on in Chedgar, the next letter is another E, which stands for evolve. And so what we're referring to here is that over time, there are going to be changes in organisms due to both mutations and the process of natural selection acting on those mutations. So it's very possible that the organisms that we have today might look very different in the future as these organisms continually evolve and change over time. Moving along, we're almost to the end of Chedgar. We have the first of two R's. The first R is reproduce. And so all living things need to make more copies of themselves. So in this example here, we have an adult hawksbill sea turtle laying eggs. The eggs then hatch, and we have these new little turtles that will then grow into full adult turtles and then repeat the cycle and reproduce more of themselves. Even simple little cells have the ability to reproduce and make more cells. So all living things need to make more of themselves. And then the last R is responding to the environment. So all living things need to react to that environment around them in order to survive. So all around an organism is an environment that is constantly full of different stimuli. It's important that living things respond to these different stimuli around them in order for them to react and adjust their behavior accordingly for survival purposes. So for example, in humans, your eyes are going to adjust as the light changes from one room to another. So if you go from a dark room to a light room, your pupils will dilate or shrink in order to adjust to that light change. Or if you take a plant and you put it in a window towards the light, the plant will literally grow in the direction of that light. Or lastly here, the example is the shark trying to eat this small fish. Well, the small fish needs to be able to swim away from its predators to prevent it from being eaten. So all living things must respond to their environment in some way. So overall, that Chedgar acronym is what you see here. So make sure that you review this summary. So cells, homeostasis, energy, DNA or RNA. All living things grow, they evolve, they reproduce, and they respond to their environment. These are the 8 characteristics that all living things must have in order to be alive.